The silent arrival. Man steps into an environment designed to break him. Everyone assumes they know exactly who he is. But what happens when silence becomes the most powerful form of communication? Get ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about strength and survival. If you're ready to discover how true power emerges in the most unexpected places, stay with this journey and consider subscribing to never miss a moment of transformation. The steel door closed behind Marcus Chen with a sound that seemed to echo through his bones. San Quentin State Prison swallowed new arrivals, like the ocean swallows stones, indifferently, completely. The intake officer processed him with mechanical efficiency, barely glancing at his face as she stamped documents and recited regulations in a monotone perfected through years of repetition. Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides, his breathing steady and deliberate. When the officer asked questions, he responded only with slight nods or minimal gestures. His eyes remained calm, almost distant, as though observing the proceedings from somewhere far away. "Doesn't speak English," the officer muttered to her colleague, making a notation on his file. "Great. Another language barrier case." They assigned him to D Block, a section known for housing the overflow population, men who didn't quite fit the security classifications of other wings. As Marcus walked the corridor flanked by two guards, inmates pressed against their cell bars, assessing the newcomer with practiced efficiency. They saw what they expected to see: a slight Asian man in his 40s, shoulders neither broad nor threatening, eyes downcast, moving with an almost feminine grace that suggested weakness. "Fresh meat," someone called out, the words followed by laughter that rippled through the cell block like wind through wheat. Marcus's expression didn't change. He walked as though alone, each step measured and purposeful, his posture suggesting neither fear nor defiance, simply presence. The guards deposited him in cell 47, a 6x8 concrete rectangle he would share with a man named Deshaun Miller. Deshaun was built like a linebacker, his arms covered in tattoos that documented a life lived hard and without apology. He looked up from his bunk as Marcus entered, his eyes narrowing with immediate calculation. "You speak English?" Deshaun asked, his voice carrying the particular edge of a man establishing dominance. Marcus met his gaze briefly, then looked away, beginning to arrange his meager belongings on the empty bunk with careful, deliberate movements. "I asked you a question," Deshaun said, rising to his full height. Marcus continued his task, folding the thin blanket with precise corners, as though performing a meditation rather than a chore. His hands moved with an economy of motion that suggested years of practice, each gesture containing no wasted energy. Deshaun watched this performance for a long moment, then settled back onto his bunk with a grunt. "Whatever, man. Just stay out of my way." The cell block gradually settled into its evening routine. The clang of doors, the shouted conversations between cells, the undercurrent of tension that never quite disappeared. Marcus sat on his bunk, legs crossed, hands resting gently on his knees, eyes closed. To anyone watching, he appeared to be sleeping, but something in the absolute stillness of his posture suggested something else entirely. A quality of attention that transforms silence into its own form of speech, the hierarchy of force. What happens when established power structures encounter something they cannot categorize? One man's refusal to engage in expected patterns creates ripples that will transform an entire environment. This chapter reveals how true strength often appears in the most unexpected forms. If you're invested in discovering how Marcus navigates the dangerous waters of prison hierarchy, make sure you're following along. Subscribe to witness every strategic move in this compelling transformation. The yard at San Quentin operated according to laws older than any written code. Territories were established and maintained through careful demonstrations of force. Respect was a currency earned through violence or the credible threat of it. Every man understood these rules with the clarity that comes from survival necessity. Marcus walked into this ecosystem on his second day with the same measured calm he had displayed since arrival. He moved along the perimeter of the yard, observing without appearing to observe, his path taking him past various clusters of inmates who had self-organized by race, gang affiliation, or mutual protection agreements. 3 men intercepted him near the weight pit. The leader was called Truck, a name he had earned through both his physical presence and his tendency to run through obstacles rather than around them. His companions flanked him with practiced coordination, creating a triangle that enclosed Marcus without appearing overtly threatening. "You need to pay respect," Truck said, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by nearby inmates without broadcasting to the guards. "New fish always pay. That's the tax for breathing our air." Marcus stopped walking. He looked at Truck with the same calm expression he wore constantly, his hands remaining loose at his sides. No tension entered his shoulders. No fear showed in his eyes, but neither was there defiance. He simply stood, present and attentive. "You hear me?" Truck stepped closer, using his physical size as punctuation. "You got cigarettes? Commissary money? Something valuable to contribute?" The yard had grown quieter. Conversations didn't stop, but attention shifted. This was familiar theater, the establishment of pecking order, the demonstration of power. Everyone expected the same conclusion. The new man would either pay up, fight back and lose, or run to protective custody, marking himself as weak forever. Marcus reached slowly into his pocket. The movement was so controlled, so devoid of threat, that Truck didn't react immediately. Marcus withdrew his hand, revealing 3 cigarettes, currency in this economy, and held them out in his open palm. But he didn't offer them. He simply stood with his hand extended, the cigarettes resting there, his eyes meeting Truck's with absolute steadiness. Truck reached for them. As his fingers closed around the cigarettes, Marcus spoke for the first time since entering the yard, his voice low and precise, carrying the particular quality of someone choosing words with extreme care. "These are given freely," Marcus said in perfect unaccented English. "Not taken." The 3 words, "not taken," seemed to carry weight beyond their simple meaning. Truck froze, his hand halfway back to his pocket, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion. Around them, the yard noise faded further as word spread instantaneously through that mysterious communication network that exists in all confined spaces. The silent man had spoken. Marcus lowered his hand and continued his walk, his pace unchanged, as though nothing significant had occurred. Truck watched him go, the cigarette suddenly feeling strange in his grip, like he had accepted something he didn't understand, a gift that might also be a message, or perhaps a test. "What the hell was that?" one of Truck's companions muttered. Truck didn't answer. He was watching Marcus's retreating figure, noting the perfect economy of movement, the absolute lack of fear or aggression, the sense that this man was somehow playing a different game entirely, one whose rules Truck didn't yet comprehend. The language of observation. Sometimes the greatest power lies not in speaking, but in truly seeing. And as Marcus continues his silent observation, others begin to realize that his supposed ignorance might have been strategic wisdom all along. This chapter explores how perception shapes reality in environments built on assumption. To continue witnessing how Marcus's true nature gradually reveals itself, stay engaged with this transformative narrative, and subscribe to ensure you don't miss the unfolding revelation. Cell 47 became an island of unusual quiet in the constant noise of D Block. Deshaun Miller had developed a grudging tolerance for his cellmates' strange habits, the morning stretches that looked like slow-motion dance, the way Marcus sat motionless for hours, the absolute discipline with which he maintained his small space. But Deshaun was also beginning to notice other things, the way Marcus's eyes tracked movements in the cell block with perfect awareness, how he always seemed to know when guards were approaching before their footsteps became audible, the fact that he positioned himself in their shared cell to maintain visual angles on the door and the small windows simultaneously. "You ain't what you seem," Deshaun said one evening, his voice carrying more curiosity than accusation. "I've been watching you watch everything." Marcus was sitting on his bunk, hands resting on his knees in that characteristic pose. He opened his eyes and looked at Deshaun with an expression that might have been amusement or might have been something else entirely. "Most people see what they expect to see," Marcus said quietly, his English carrying the precision of someone who had studied language as both tool and weapon. "I simply didn't correct their expectations." Deshaun sat up, fully engaged now. "So you've understood everything since you got here? Every conversation, every threat, every play?" "Yes." "Why?" What's the angle? Marcus was silent for a long moment, considering whether to answer or how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke with the careful deliberation that characterized all his words. Information is advantage. People speak freely around those they believe cannot understand them. They reveal true intentions, real alliances, genuine weaknesses. By remaining silent, I've learned the actual structure of this place. Not the formal hierarchy, but the real networks of power and fear that govern daily life. Deshaun absorbed this, his respect for his cellmate increasing exponentially. That's cold, man. Strategic. It's survival, Marcus corrected gently. Nothing more, nothing less. Over the following days, Marcus's careful observation bore fruit in ways that began to ripple through D Block. He noticed that a guard named Thompson always checked the third cell on the left side first during evening counts, creating a predictable pattern. He observed that the kitchen worker known as Preach controlled a significant percentage of commissary trades through a network of debts and favors that remained invisible to official eyes. He understood that the real power in their section belonged not to the loudest or most violent inmates, but to an older man named Solomon, who rarely spoke but whose opinion, when offered, carried absolute weight. Marcus also noticed the small acts of humanity that persisted despite the environment's brutality. The way inmates shared medications with those who needed them. How younger prisoners received protection from predatory behavior through informal guardian relationships. The existence of a book club that met in whispered conversations during rec time, discussing literature with genuine intellectual engagement. This dual understanding of both the violence and the humanity shaped Marcus's navigation of prison life. He avoided conflicts not through cowardice, but through strategic positioning, always present but never quite where trouble developed. He offered small assistances without creating debts or obligations. His silence had been protective coloring. His speech, when it came, was measured currency spent only when necessary. The incident with Truck had created a ripple of uncertainty. Marcus hadn't fought, hadn't run, hadn't submitted in any recognizable way. He had simply existed outside the expected categories, and in an environment built entirely on predictable patterns, this made him simultaneously fascinating and threatening, the test of character. True character reveals itself not in how we handle power, but in how we respond when confronted with injustice against others. Watch as Marcus faces a situation that will force him to choose between continued invisibility and deliberate action. This chapter demonstrates why moral courage often requires the greatest strength. If you are committed to seeing how principle manifests in the most challenging circumstances, subscribe now to follow Marcus's journey through every critical decision point. The incident began in the cafeteria during lunch, a time when the population mixed in ways that didn't occur elsewhere in the prison. Marcus sat alone, as had become his habit, eating with focused attention while maintaining peripheral awareness of the room's dynamics. At a table near the serving line, a young inmate named Kevin, barely 20, small-framed, with eyes that still held shock at finding himself in this environment, sat trembling as three older inmates surrounded him. The confrontation was quiet enough not to attract immediate guard attention, but obvious enough that everyone nearby understood what was happening. Recruitment or victimization, the two options offered to the vulnerable. Marcus watched this unfold while continuing to eat, his expression unchanged. This was not his business. Prison survival depended on maintaining clear boundaries around involvement. What happened to Kevin was unfortunate but inevitable in an ecosystem built on predation. The young man's eyes swept the room desperately, seeking help that wouldn't come. His gaze passed over Marcus, then returned, perhaps recognizing something in the older man's calm presence, some quality that suggested safety or understanding. Marcus looked away, returning attention to his meal. Self-preservation required this detachment. But even as he made this calculation, something else rose in his consciousness, a voice from years of training that spoke about duty, about the responsibility of capability, about what it meant to be human in environments designed to strip humanity away. The three men were rising now, positioning Kevin to follow them from the cafeteria. One placed a hand on the young man's shoulder with a possessive familiarity. Kevin's face showed the particular desperation of someone watching their last exit close. Marcus set down his fork with precise control. He stood, his movements drawing attention through their deliberate quality, and walked directly toward the group. Several inmates noticed this trajectory and conversations faltered. Walking toward trouble, toward confrontation, was always noteworthy. "Kevin," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet, "your cellmate asked me to find you. He needs to discuss the library request forms before afternoon count." The lie was smooth, delivered with absolute confidence. The three men turned toward Marcus, their expressions shifting through surprise toward calculation. They recognized him, the silent man who had given Truck cigarettes, the Asian inmate who moved like water and spoke like someone carrying authority that had nothing to do with violence. "We're having a private conversation," the largest of them said, his voice containing warning. Marcus looked at him with that same calm regard he showed everything. "Kevin and I have an appointment. You're welcome to continue your conversation afterward." The statement created an impossible situation. To back down was to show weakness. To escalate was to commit to confrontation with an unknown variable. The man hesitated, caught between options, aware that the cafeteria was watching and that reputations lived or died in these moments. Kevin, sensing opportunity, stood quickly. "Yeah, Marcus, sorry, I forgot about the forms. We should go handle that." The young man moved toward Marcus with desperate speed, his relief palpable. Marcus didn't step back or create space. He simply stood, waiting, his presence serving as shelter. The three men watched this defection with obvious anger, but something in Marcus's absolute stillness prevented immediate retaliation. He wasn't threatening them, wasn't challenging their authority. He was simply standing there, immovable as stone, creating a space where violence seemed suddenly inappropriate or impossible. "We'll continue this later," the leader finally said, trying to reclaim dignity through the promise of future confrontation. Marcus nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without accepting its premise, then turned and walked toward the exit with Kevin following close behind, almost hiding in his shadow. Behind them, conversations resumed with the particular energy that follows witness drama. The weight of consequence. Every action creates ripples that extend beyond immediate circumstances. Marcus's intervention on Kevin's behalf has set forces in motion that will test both his wisdom and his resolve. This chapter reveals how true leadership emerges through accepting the weight of one's choices. To witness how Marcus navigates the consequences of his decision, make sure you're subscribed and following this journey of transformation and principle. Word of the cafeteria incident spread through San Quentin with the speed that information always travels in confined spaces. By evening count, everyone in D Block knew that the quiet Asian man had intervened in someone else's business, had essentially claimed Kevin under some form of protection, and had done so in a way that made retaliation complicated but inevitable. Marcus sat on his bunk, aware that his period of careful observation had ended. He had made himself visible, had declared himself someone willing to intervene in the prison's established order. This would require response. Deshawn watched him with new eyes. "You know what you did today, right? You just painted a target on your back." "I'm aware," Marcus said quietly. "So why? That kid's nothing to you. He can't protect you, can't offer anything worth having. You could have stayed neutral, stayed safe." Marcus was silent for several breaths, considering how to articulate something he barely understood himself. The impulse that had overridden strategic calculation, the internal voice that had proven stronger than survival instinct. "I spent 23 years in the Marine Corps," he finally said, his voice carrying a quality of reflection rather than boast. 15 of those as a martial arts instructor, teaching hand-to-hand combat and tactical discipline. I've trained hundreds of men and women in how to hurt people efficiently." Deshawn listened intently, the pieces of Marcus's puzzle beginning to cohere into something recognizable. "But the deeper lessons," Marcus continued, "weren't about violence. They were about responsibility, about what it means to have capability and how that capability creates obligation. The weak need protection not because they deserve it, but because allowing predation diminishes everyone. It transforms communities into hunting grounds." "Noble thoughts," Deshawn said, though not dismissively. "But this ain't the Marines, this is prison. Different rules apply. Are they? Marcus looked at his cellmate directly. Or do we just tell ourselves that to justify surrendering our humanity? Every environment operates by the rules its participants enforce. If everyone accepts that predation is inevitable, then it becomes inevitable. But if enough people refuse to accept it, something else becomes possible. Deshaun shook his head, respect and concern mixing in his expression. Man, you're either the wisest person I've ever met, or you're going to get yourself killed. Maybe both. That night, Marcus lay awake listening to the sounds of D-Block. The coughs, the nightmares, the whispered conversations, the grinding of teeth, and the prayers muttered into darkness. Every man here carried weight. Some had earned their place through genuine violence. Others had made mistakes in moments of desperation or stupidity. All of them lived now in this concrete pressure chamber where past and future collapsed into an eternal, grinding present. His own journey here involved circumstances he rarely allowed himself to examine. A bar fight that had escalated beyond control. A man who had struck first but fallen hardest. Manslaughter charges that his military record couldn't erase. 8 years sentenced, 3 already served, an indefinite future stretching ahead. He had chosen silence initially as strategy, but also as penance. If speech created obligation, then silence offered protection from the weight of connection, from the responsibility of being seen as someone with answers or strength. The intervention with Kevin had shattered that protective silence. Now he was visible, marked as someone willing to act, someone whose principles might be tested. The thought brought neither pride nor fear, only a quiet acceptance of consequence, the understanding that certain lines once crossed could not be uncrossed. In the cell below, someone was weeping. The sound was muffled, probably concealed behind a pillow, but audible nonetheless. Marcus listened to that private grief and understood that this, too, was part of the weight, the awareness of suffering that silence had allowed him to acknowledge without bearing. But that speech and action now made his responsibility to address, or at least to witness, honestly. The mathematics of respect. Reputation in confined spaces operates according to precise mathematical principles. As Marcus faces the inevitable confrontation his intervention created, he must calculate the exact response that will establish boundaries without escalating violence. This chapter explores the delicate balance between strength and restraint. Subscribe to witness how decades of training manifest in moments of critical choice, and how true mastery reveals itself through perfect control. The confrontation came 3 days later in the yard, during the afternoon recreation period, when guard oversight was present but not oppressive. Marcus had anticipated this timing, public enough to serve as demonstration, but not so flagrant as to guarantee immediate official intervention. The 3 men from the cafeteria approached with backup this time, 6 total, spreading out with practiced coordination that suggested gang affiliation and collective action protocols. Truck was among them, his presence indicating that this had been escalated to a question of general respect rather than personal grievance. Marcus stood near the basketball court, having positioned himself in open space with multiple exit vectors. He watched them come with the same calm regard he showed everything, his breathing steady, his hands loose at his sides. "We need to address some disrespect," Truck said, loud enough that nearby inmates turned to watch, forming that distinctive circle that always appeared around pending violence, close enough to see, far enough to claim non-involvement. Marcus waited, allowing Truck to speak, giving him the respect of being heard. "You interfered in business that wasn't yours. You claimed something, someone, that other people had prior claim to. That requires correction." "Kevin is not property," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying, despite its low volume. "He's a person. No one has claim to another person." "Idealistic bullshit," one of the backup men said. "This is prison. Different rules." "No," Marcus replied, and now his voice contained something that made several of the watching inmates step back slightly. "Same rules. Human rules. The ones that exist underneath all the structures we build to avoid acknowledging them." Truck moved closer, entering the critical space where violence becomes not just possible but likely. "You think you're better than us? Think your military background makes you special? I think every person has the right to not be victimized, Marcus said. I think that right doesn't disappear because we're in prison. And I think enforcing that right is everyone's responsibility, not just authorities. Then you're either going to have to enforce it right now, Truck said, his hands beginning to form fists. What happened next occurred with such speed and precision that many of the watching inmates would later disagree about the exact sequence of events. Truck stepped forward, beginning to throw a punch. Marcus moved laterally, not back but to the side, his hands rising in a defensive posture that was somehow also a statement of readiness. But he didn't strike. Instead, he spoke, his voice carrying absolute certainty. If you throw that punch, you'll break your hand on my defense, and you'll still be standing in the same place, having accomplished nothing except demonstrating that violence doesn't resolve the actual question. Truck froze mid-motion, his fist cocked back, his face showing confusion. The statement was so unexpected, so strangely confident, that it interrupted the automatic escalation of confrontation. The actual question, Marcus continued, his voice still calm but now carrying an edge of command that every veteran of military service in the watching crowd recognized instantly, is whether this community operates by predation or by principle. Whether strength exists to dominate or to protect. That question won't be answered by you hitting me or me hitting you. It will only be answered by what we choose, together, about what kind of environment this becomes. The yard had gone completely silent. Guards were approaching now, having noticed the gathered crowd, but they moved without urgency, sensing that whatever was happening wasn't following normal confrontation patterns. Truck lowered his fist slowly, his expression cycling through anger towards something more complicated. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of having encountered something he didn't quite understand. You're either crazy or you got balls the size of Mount Rushmore, Truck said finally. Neither, Marcus replied. I'm just someone who decided that living by principle matters more than living safely. The ripple of change. One moment of principled action creates possibilities that extend far beyond its immediate participants. As Marcus's stand begins to affect the broader prison culture, others must decide whether they will embrace or resist transformation. This chapter examines how courage becomes contagious when it manifests with authenticity. Stay subscribed to see how individual choice cascades into collective change and how environments transform when even one person refuses to accept their designated limitations. The days following the confrontation brought unexpected developments. Kevin, no longer shadowed by threat, began to emerge from protective isolation. He started attending the prison library regularly, volunteering to help organize the inadequate collection of books. Other inmates noticed this freedom, this ability to move without fear, and began to wonder about its source. Deshaun observed these changes from his unique vantage point as Marcus's cellmate. You realize what you've created, right? He said one evening. That kid's not just free from those specific predators. Other people are leaving him alone too. Word got out that he's under your, what, protection? Philosophy? Marcus looked up from the book he was reading, a worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, its pages soft from decades of prison handling. Not my protection, everyone's protection. That's the difference. Explain. Marcus set the book aside, recognizing the genuine curiosity in his cellmate's question. If people believe Kevin is safe because I personally will retaliate against threats, then his safety depends on my continued presence and willingness to fight. That's just replacing one form of domination with another. But if people understand that Kevin is safe because we've collectively decided that predation is unacceptable, then his safety becomes community property. It's self-reinforcing rather than dependent on any single person. That's a nice theory, Deshaun said skeptically, but it assumes people care about community standards in a place designed to destroy community. People always care, Marcus countered gently. They just need permission to acknowledge that they care, and examples that demonstrate caring is possible without weakness. This conversation was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Solomon, the older inmate whose quiet authority Deshaun had mentioned weeks earlier, appeared at their cell door during the brief period before evening lockdown. He was perhaps 60, his hair completely gray, his face carrying lines that suggested both wisdom and hard-earned survival. "Marcus Chen," Solomon said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. Marcus stood, moving to the cell door with respectful attention. "Yes, sir." The honorific, "sir," caused Deshawn's eyebrows to rise. Prison culture rarely acknowledged such formal respect between inmates. "Walk with me," Solomon said, and turned without waiting for response. Marcus followed, aware that this summons carries significance beyond its casual delivery. They walked the short distance to the common area, currently empty in the pre-lockdown period, and Solomon settled onto one of the bolted-down chairs with the careful movement of someone whose body had absorbed decades of hard use. "I've been watching you since you arrived," Solomon said without preamble. The silence, then the speech. The observation, then the action. "You're either very smart or very dangerous, possibly both." Marcus sat in the adjacent chair, maintaining respectful posture. "I'm just trying to serve my time with as much humanity as possible." "No," Solomon said, and his voice carried absolute certainty. "You're trying to change how time is served. That's different, and it matters." Solomon leaned forward slightly, his gaze direct and assessing. "I've been here 23 years, seen generations of inmates cycle through, seen every possible approach to surviving this environment. Most men adapt by hardening. They become versions of themselves that can endure violence by embracing it. A few break, fewer still maintain some core of who they were before, protecting it like a flame in wind." He paused, letting this framework settle. "But what you're attempting, changing the environment itself rather than adapting to it, that's rare. Rare enough that it might actually matter." "I'm not attempting anything systematic," Marcus said carefully. "I just responded to a specific situation according to my principles." "Exactly," Solomon smiled slightly. "That's what makes it powerful. You're not trying to start a movement or claim authority. You're just living according to code and letting others decide whether that code has value. That authenticity matters more than any grand plan." The cost of principle. Living by principle in environments designed to punish principle requires accepting costs that others avoid. As Marcus's influence grows, so does the attention of those who profit from maintaining the status quo. This chapter explores the price of transformation and the calculations required when principle confronts power. Subscribe to witness how Marcus faces the inevitable backlash his choices have created, and how integrity manifests when testing becomes truly severe. The warning came through prison's informal communication network, passed from cell to cell through whispered conversations and significant glances. A group of inmates tied to external gang structures had taken notice of Marcus's disruption of established patterns. His intervention with Kevin had cost them a potential recruit. His philosophical stance threatened the fear-based control that made various prison enterprises possible. Something was coming. The shape remained unclear, but the certainty was absolute. Marcus received this information with the same calm acceptance. He showed everything. Though he increased his situational awareness and modified his routines to minimize vulnerability. He stopped lingering in blind corners, varied his walking paths, ensured he was never completely isolated during recreation periods. Deshawn watched these adjustments with growing concern. "Man, you need to talk to the guards. Request protective custody. What you're facing isn't a fair fight, it's a planned hit." "Protective custody means abandoning everything I've claimed about how this environment can function," Marcus replied. "It means accepting that principle retreats before violence, that the only safety comes through official authority rather than community standards." "It means staying alive," Deshawn said bluntly. "What good are your principles if you're dead?" Marcus considered this question seriously, recognizing its fundamental weight. "I spent my military career teaching people how to fight. I could have taught purely technique, how to strike, where to hurt, methods for overcoming opponents. But I always included philosophy, the why beneath the how. I taught that martial arts aren't about domination, but about creating safety through strength that protects rather than threatens." He looked directly at his cellmate. "If I abandon that teaching now, when it becomes personally dangerous, then I prove it was always just empty words. I prove that principle only matters when it's convenient, and that makes everything I taught, Everything I believed, worthless. That's martyrdom, Deshawn said, frustration evident. That's choosing death for ego. No, Marcus said quietly. It's choosing integrity over survival. There's a difference. The attack came 3 days later, during the controlled chaos of meal service, when bodies pressed close and guard sight lines were partially obstructed. Marcus sensed the shift in crowd dynamics, the way space was being created and controlled around him, the positioning of bodies that suggested coordinated action. He turned toward the threat rather than away, his body shifting into defensive posture with the automatic precision of decades of training. 3 men moved simultaneously, one from each angle, their hands carrying crude weapons improvised from prison materials, a sharpened metal strip, a sock weighted with batteries, a piece of wood carved to a point. What followed happened in compressed time, each second containing multiple calculations and responses. Marcus's first movement intercepted the nearest attacker's wrist, redirecting the improvised blade away from his body while delivering a precise strike to the nerve cluster in the man's forearm. The weapon clattered to the floor. The second attacker's weighted sock swung toward Marcus's head. He ducked beneath it while simultaneously kicking backward, catching the third man in the knee with enough force to buckle the joint. The second attacker overextended, his momentum carrying him forward. Marcus guided this motion, adding just enough force to send the man stumbling into a table. The entire exchange lasted perhaps 4 seconds. 3 attackers were down or neutralized. Marcus stood breathing heavily but controlled, his hands raised in defensive posture, his eyes scanning for additional threats. Guards rushed in, whistles blowing, ordering everyone to the ground. Marcus complied immediately, placing his hands behind his head, assuming the position that demonstrated non-resistance to authority. His attackers did the same, blood and pain making their compliance slower but equally inevitable. Later, in the segregation cell where he was placed pending investigation, Marcus sat in the darkness and examined what had occurred. He had responded with exactly sufficient force, no more than necessary to protect himself, no gratuitous violence, no excess that would have transformed legitimate self-defense into assault. Every strike had been precise, controlled, measured. But he also understood that this would not be the last confrontation. His refusal to back down, combined with his demonstrated capability, had made him a problem that required resolution. The unexpected alliance. Sometimes transformation emerges from the most unlikely coalitions. As Marcus faces formal charges for the cafeteria fight, support emerges from unexpected quarters, revealing how his principled stance has affected others more deeply than he realized. This chapter explores how authenticity creates alliances that transcend normal boundaries. Stay subscribed to witness how collective action emerges when individual courage inspires others to find their own voices and risk their own safety for shared principles. The investigation into the cafeteria incident followed predictable patterns. Marcus sat in the hearing room across from 3 prison officials, a captain, a counselor, and a classification committee representative. Security footage from multiple angles played on a monitor, showing the attack and Marcus's response with clinical clarity. "You demonstrated military combat training," the captain observed, his tone neutral, but his implications clear. "Training that could be considered a weapon in itself." "I defended myself using minimum necessary force," Marcus replied calmly. "I could have caused significantly more damage, but chose restraint." "Or you're skilled enough to know exactly how much violence you could demonstrate without crossing into territory that would add time to your sentence," the counselor suggested. Before Marcus could respond, the hearing room door opened. Solomon entered, followed by 3 other inmates, including, surprisingly, Truck. Behind them came Kevin, his presence unexpected and somehow powerful despite his slight frame. "We're here to provide testimony regarding the incident," Solomon said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected to be heard. The captain frowned. "This is an administrative hearing, not a trial. Inmate testimony isn't standard protocol." "Then make an exception," Solomon said simply. "What happened in that cafeteria matters beyond just disciplinary procedure. It matters to how this institution functions." Something in Solomon's tone made the officials pause. There was no threat in it, but there was certainty. the sense that what happened next would have consequences beyond this room. 5 minutes, the captain said finally. Solomon nodded, then looked at Truck. Tell them what you told me. Truck stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with speaking to authority, but committed nonetheless. Marcus didn't start that fight. He was targeted for stopping some predatory bullshit earlier. When they came at him, he could have hurt them bad. I've seen combat training before, and this man's got skills that could have put all three in the infirmary. Instead, he stopped them without doing real damage. That's not assault, that's restraint. Kevin spoke next, his voice quiet but steady. Marcus saved me from being victimized. He didn't know me, didn't have any reason to help, but he did it anyway because it was right. Since then, I've been safe here, not because Marcus personally protects me, but because his example showed others that predation doesn't have to be tolerated. A third inmate Marcus barely knew, a younger man named Rodriguez, spoke with unexpected passion. I've been watching how things changed after Marcus arrived. It's like someone finally said out loud what a lot of us were thinking but were too scared to admit, that we don't have to accept that this place is just survival of the strongest. We can create something different if enough of us decide it matters. The officials listened with expressions that mixed skepticism with something else, perhaps recognition that they were witnessing something unusual, something that didn't fit the standard categories of prison dynamics. Finally, Solomon spoke, his words carrying the weight of his decades of observation and survival. Marcus Chen represents a choice about what kind of community we create inside these walls. He's not trying to control anyone, not claiming territory or building power. He's just living according to principles that most of us claim to value but rarely risk anything to uphold. Punishing him for self-defense sends a message that principle is weakness. Supporting him sends a different message, that integrity matters even here. The hearing room fell silent. The officials exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, the captain spoke. We'll review the testimony and the footage. Pending final decision, Mr. Chen will return to general population under standard supervision. This hearing is concluded. As they filed out, Truck paused beside Marcus. Didn't think I'd ever speak up for somebody in a hearing, he said quietly. But what you're doing, it matters. Makes me think maybe I don't have to be who I've been. Marcus nodded, accepting this confession without making it heavier through unnecessary response. We all get to choose who we become. Every day, every moment. Choice. The transformation of space. 6 months after his arrival to Miami, Marcus has fundamentally altered the social dynamics of D-Block without seeking power or demanding change. This final chapter explores how sustained principle creates lasting transformation and how one person's integrity can inspire collective evolution. Subscribe to follow Marcus's continued journey and discover how authentic leadership emerges not through force but through the patient, persistent embodiment of deeply held values in the face of every possible resistance. The changes in D-Block were subtle enough that no single moment marked their emergence, yet profound enough that everyone who had been there before Marcus's arrival felt them. The reduction in predatory behavior wasn't absolute. Human nature and institutional pressure ensured that violence and exploitation never completely disappeared, but it had diminished noticeably. Kevin worked regularly in the library now, helping other inmates navigate the limited educational resources available. He had started a reading group that met in the common area, discussing everything from philosophy to fiction with genuine intellectual engagement. 15 men attended regularly, including several who had initially been part of his intended victimization. Truck had become an unexpected ally. His physical presence and gang connections, combined with his new willingness to support rather than exploit vulnerable inmates, created a protective umbrella that extended Marcus's philosophical approach through more traditional power structures. He never articulated this shift explicitly, but his actions demonstrated how principle could operate through existing hierarchies rather than requiring their destruction. Solomon remained the quiet authority, but even he had evolved. In conversations with Marcus, held during yard time or in occasional shared meal periods, he explored questions about rehabilitation, purpose, and possibility that he had long ago dismissed as naive. You've accomplished something unusual, Solomon said during one of these conversations. not by preaching or organizing, but simply by being consistent. People watch for hypocrisy, for the moment when stated values meet inconvenient reality and get abandoned. You haven't given them that moment. Marcus considered this assessment carefully. I think the real accomplishment belongs to everyone who chose to embrace the possibility that things could be different. I just offered an example. They did the work of making it real. Don't be falsely modest, Solomon said with slight smile. Example is everything. Most men here have never encountered someone who genuinely lives by principle, regardless of cost. They've seen people talk about values, but they've rarely seen someone willing to accept violence, punishment, and isolation, rather than compromise what they claim to believe. The official decision on Marcus's cafeteria incident had been surprisingly lenient. No added time, no transfer to higher security, no extended segregation. The officials had apparently recognized that the alternative to supporting Marcus's approach was tacitly endorsing the predatory culture his actions had disrupted. By defending himself with precise restraint, he had forced them to choose between principle and expedience. Deshawn had become something more than a cellmate, not quite a friend in the traditional sense, but a companion in the project of daily survival and gradual transformation. Their cell remained an island of relative peace within D-Block's continued turbulence. You ever think about what happens when you get out? Deshawn asked one evening. When you're back into the world and all this is just memory? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the question's deeper implications. I think about whether the person I've become here, or maybe rediscovered here, can exist outside these walls. Whether principle that matters in prison also matters in freedom, or whether I'll just slide back into the comfortable compromises that most of life seems designed to encourage. That's heavy, Deshawn said. Everything here is heavy, Marcus replied. But maybe that's valuable. Maybe the weight forces us to decide what we're actually willing to carry, what matters enough to bear burden for. Freedom lets us avoid that decision. Confinement makes it unavoidable. Later that night, as D-Block settled into its restless approximation of sleep, Marcus lay awake listening to familiar sounds, coughs, nightmares, whispered prayers, the grinding of teeth, and suppressed weeping. But now, interwoven with these expressions of suffering, he heard something else. Quiet conversations about books being read, plans being made for post-release futures, support being offered between cellmates who had learned they could trust each other. The changes were incremental, incomplete, constantly threatened by the institutional pressures and human failings that made prison such a crucible. But they were real. They proved that even in environments designed to strip humanity away, human dignity could persist if enough people refused to surrender it. Marcus closed his eyes, allowing exhaustion to finally pull him towards sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, confrontations, decisions, moments requiring the choice between convenience and principle. But tonight he could rest in the knowledge that he had remained true to something important, had demonstrated that discipline and integrity could survive even here, and had helped create space where others could discover the same truth. In the darkness, surrounded by concrete and steel, and the weight of years still to be served, Marcus found something approaching peace. Not comfort, not happiness, but the deeper satisfaction that comes from living according to values that transcend circumstance. He had entered San Quentin silent, carrying wisdom he kept hidden. He had spoken only when necessary, acted only when principle demanded it, and through these measured choices had transformed not just his own experience, but the collective reality of everyone around him. The new prisoner hadn't spoken English until his words, carefully chosen and precisely delivered, had indeed silenced the whole yard. But that silence wasn't submission or fear. It was the silence of recognition, the moment when people encounter something genuine in an environment saturated with performance and posturing. That recognition, Marcus understood, was the real transformation. Not changing who people were, but giving them permission to remember who they had always been beneath the armor and violence. That memory, once awakened, could change everything. If this story resonated with you, if Marcus's journey inspired reflection on your own principles and the courage required to live them, Please subscribe to receive more narratives exploring human resilience, moral courage, and the transformative power of integrity in the face of overwhelming challenge. Share this story with others who might benefit from its message, and join a community committed to discovering how individual choice creates collective transformation, one principled decision at a time.